Anyway, thanks very much for coming out on a chilly night. I hope to warm you up with some tales of science in the tropics and to rile you up with some tales of flagrant data misuse, which I thought was a perfect theme for lead skeptics and really kind of myth-busting a big story that was about 10 years ago. Those of you who weren't embryos at the time, looking at that table there, you might remember that there was a lot of press coverage of a forthcoming survey to go and investigate and potentially recover a lost squadron of Spitfire aircraft in Myanmar, in Burma. And I was part of that project. And the more it went on, the weirder and weirder it got. And so it really does start to play on concepts of myth, memory, and data misuse. As you'll find out, I think that archaeology and archaeological geophysics sometimes comes across as a relatively benign subject, but actually it really does kind of uncover some darker truths about who we are and who we want to be. So I'll be talking about that through the next half hour. It is quite a convoluted story, and you might very well leave with more questions than you have answers. But Christmas is coming, and there is a book available that documents the story of the buried Spitfires of Burma. There is also a documentary that is supposed to be released in maybe the next year. It means I get my own IMDb thumbnail. Yeah, so just a plug for some other stuff that is associated with this project. As much as we likely concluded that there are really not very many Spitfires buried in Burma, the kind of tale that goes with it and how we arrive at that tale is really quite a fascinating one, so I hope to shed some light on that for you in the next 30 minutes or so. So like I say, sometimes archaeological geophysics doesn't come across as the kind of thing that would be awfully controversial or a source for scepticism. There are other things that I do as a geophysicist where you become much more involved with kind of hot topics and kind of relevant scientific debate. So, for example, I've done geophysical surveys in Antarctica, and there you're doing work that helps inform kind of ice dynamics, contributes to the climate argument, contributes to the climate debate, and you do get people who are climate deniers who wonder what you're doing. We've just had a project funded where we're looking at the application of geophysical surveys, of subsurface imaging, to understand geothermal prospects beneath urban centres. And there are questions about, well, what happens if you start exploiting this geothermal resource and you cause subsidence and the town starts to collapse? Or concepts of like heat governance, who actually owns the heat beneath the ground? How do you know that you have the right to produce that heat? Now, these are kind of really big things that they're quite emotive subjects sometimes. They really do engage people in debate. Archaeology maybe is sometimes seen as not being like that, but particularly when it comes to conflict archaeology, we can really start to encounter some very weird senses of who we are. So, for example, if I put that image up on the screen, give me some words, but what does it make you think of? What words pop to your mind when you see that image there? Spitfire. Okay, right. It's a Spitfire, but what else? Let's go, what does it maybe mean to you? What does it represent?
Eastern.
Say again?
Eastern. It's where I'm from, it's Southampton, and it's where they live.
Oh, right. Well, funnily enough, one of the things it means to me, one of the things that will pop up here in a minute is nostalgia, because Reginald Mitchell, who's the fellow who designed them, comes from Staffordshire, and so there's a Spitfire in a museum in Stoke, and we used to go see it when I was a kid. So, kindred spirits, me and you, linked by Spitfires. Anyone else?
Bozo.
Say again?
Bozo, it's written on the side.
Oh yeah, right, Bozo, yeah, that's a...
Victory.
Right, victory, okay, right, so not just war, but victory as well. Right, airfix. I would class that under nostalgia again. Now, I did actually put this out to some people on Facebook as well, and a lot of people did say airfix. But, you know, other people were saying war, for example. And knowing my sort of friend bubble within Facebook, I don't think they meant war. I think they meant war. So yeah, there's that. But then there was other people who were saying things like pride and respect and honour and things like that. So the Spitfire is more than just an inanimate, well, okay, it's pretty animate, it's moving pretty fast there, but yeah, non-sentient instrument of death and destruction. It means something more, particularly to a British audience. It is a symbol of the war. You know, nostalgia, pride, tenacity, a good bit of British pluck. Things like war, patriotism, remembrance. Patriotism is a really problematic one in a way because it speaks to sort of like colonial issues. If indeed there were Spitfires buried in Burma, they'd be the property of the Burmese. So for people to say it's a British patriotic interest, well, it's not, it's in Burma now. But it's strange because when people start talking about the archaeology of conflict, and particularly the archaeology of conflict when it means Spitfires, they almost talk about Spitfire aircraft with the same reverence that you would give to a fallen serviceman. They talk about the need to repatriate these Spitfires, as if the Spitfire has a family that is grieving for us or something like that. Say, oh, bring them home for us. Like, they don't know, you know, wherever they are. They never knew where they were. So, yeah, you know, it represents something more than just a particular aircraft. You don't find this with other types of aircraft. You don't find it with other types of military vehicles. So it's much more about what it represents. And that feeling, that association can make people act in some fairly strange ways. But first, before we get into that, I want to give you a quick crash course about what geophysics is all about. Basically, geophysics is using the laws of physics to say something meaningful about the structure, about targets within the subsurface, without having to dig it up. It's often quicker to do a geophysical survey, and therefore cheaper to do a geophysical survey, than excavating a target. It's also a non-invasive technique. The target is left undisturbed, and that's particularly important when you are looking for, say, valuable archaeological remains that you don't want to damage by just putting a shovel straight through them. In conflict archaeology, it's quite possible that there might be unexploded ammunition down there. Again, you don't want to put your shovel through it and find it the hard way. It has become very widespread throughout archaeological surveying, and usually you won't find that an archaeological excavation happens without first having done a geophysical survey to help target where those excavations are going to take place. Here, for example, is a little bit of geophysical data, which you might be a bit small from the back, but you might be able to see there's this coloured region in there. And that is a geophysical survey over an air crash site at Nuthamstead Airfield. And this is wreckage of a Mosquito aircraft from the Second World War. What we've done is walked over with a piece of geophysical equipment that detects variations in the strength of the Earth's magnetic field. And as such, we've mapped out this area, found that there is sort of wreckage in the ground there that's consistent with this crash site, and then there was an excavation there starting to recover elements of this Mosquito wreckage. But it's important to realise that there are limitations. There's what we call finite resolution with the geophysical data. What we get is sort of amorphous blobs rather than responses to discrete components of things in the ground. The fact we've got an amorphous blob there is enough for us to say, aha, there is something interesting in the site here and it's worth investigating, it's worth excavating. But we certainly wouldn't go and say, ha-ha, there's the tail of the plane, there's the wing of the plane, there's the lower left undercarriage of the plane, or something like that. It is not a Spitfire detector, it is not a Mosquito detector. If we find something that's consistent with buried metal in the ground, most we can say is that it looks like there's some buried metal in the ground. It takes circumstantial, contextual evidence to say, okay, and that is likely this particular plane or this particular target. So moving into the Spitfire story, like I say, it is a bit of a convolutional one. It's a story in 3 acts. And so Act 1 is the origins of the Spitfire story. And to help you frame this, I've got a bit of a timeline for you. So the story spans 1945 to 2013. And so I'm going to tell you this story in the order that it was presented to me and that we moved through the project. So this starts in 2004 when I was approached by this man here, David Cundall. David Cundall is a farmer from Scunthorpe, and he's a Spitfire devotee. He has kind of excavated Spitfires here and there. He's identified crash sites from either people's accounts or historical records, and he's gone and excavated them and recovered parts of these planes. But David Kundall had this idea that there was a lost squadron of Spitfires that were buried at an airbase in Burma. And one of his primary sources for that was this gentleman here, Stan Coombe. Stan Coombe, in 1945, had basically just joined up, and he was in the army, and he was at RAF Mingaladon, which might not be able to be written just there, but that was an RAF airbase in Rangoon, now Yangon, the former capital of Myanmar. And Stan was travelling on the so-called prone road on the back of the truck, and the prone road crossed the runway of RAF Mingaladon. And at some point the truck stopped to either take on fuel or get some orders or whatever, and Stan was mucking about, and there was a whole load of crates on the side of this road. And he asked some engineers, what's in them crates? And the engineers turned around and said, would you believe the Spitfires? And this story went on then, that those Spitfires were being prepared for burial at that site. Stan got back in the truck and they moved on, and off they went. But this account got round to various people and came round to David Kundall. Some of David's other evidence is that these are pictures apparently showing Spitfires being made ready for burial in Burma. And that was done on the orders of Lord Louis Mountbatten, who at the time was the, I can't remember quite his title, but he was the sort of the boss of Allied operations within the Southeast Asian sphere. So this was kind of like some evidence. Louis Mountbatten suggested that they should bury these Spitfires in order to supply sort of pro-Allied guerrilla movements within Myanmar at the end of the Second World War. They did not want Myanmar to fall back under Japanese influence, so they would leave these Spitfires as kind of a hidden cache for anyone who wanted to come along and use them. So David approached me with the idea that could we use some geophysics to try and identify whether these things were actually buried and where they are, and inform the depth and things like that. Now, coming back to our Spitfire, we talked about its kind of emotive associations. What do I think about it? As a geophysicist, I see potential buried metal. It's got a lot of aluminium in it. There's some steel in the sort of armaments and the engine. And when you imagine that David is saying there's potentially 12 of these things, when they're in those crates that you saw before, that's potentially sort of a massive target for us in the ground. You know, all these plane components in these boxes, whether they are still air-filled, whether they've managed to flood and filled with water, either way, that's a big target for us to start looking at. What we need is kind of some sort of big metal detector. They're at a depth of up to 10 metres or so. David suggests, like, you know, maybe 20 foot or something like that. So that's the kind of depth range that we're looking at. And so as a geophysicist, what I'm looking at is detecting the contrast between the metal in these boxes and the surrounding soil. So we used what we call electromagnetic techniques for this. It's basically a sophisticated metal detector, and we're looking for electrical conductivity anomalies in this area. The piece of equipment we use is shown here, demonstrated by a couple of my old students. They've got these two hoops that you carry along. They transmit electromagnetic fields, and the interaction between the fields that they transmit and any conductive things in the ground gives us a response on one of these consoles here. So we can end up with a proxy for the buried metallic content in the ground. So, what happened to RAF Mingaladon was, according to David, it was abandoned in, I think, the 1960s, and so now it's a field where we could go and survey. So in July 2004, I went out to Myanmar with David, and we did some initial preliminary geophysical surveys. Turns out that RAF Mingaladon is not actually an abandoned airbase, and what it is the main international airport in Yangon. far from abandoned. There were planes going just behind me all the time. And this grassy area here, just shown here, is the sort of field area that we're looking at. So David's suggestion is that these Spitfires are buried somewhere under the ground here. Just a quick map for you. There is, it's actually a very modern photograph of Yangon International Airport. but there's been quite a lot of infrastructural development over here, but the field area still remains visible in Google Earth. So we had this survey grid here, a 100 metre by 180 metre survey grid, and we went around with our electromagnetic equipment scanning for buried targets. And here's the kind of data that we got. We can use this equipment in two different ways. We can change its configuration slightly to give us sensitivity to very shallow objects in the upper image and somewhat deeper objects in the deeper image here. And the brighter the white colours in this image, the more electrical conductivity there is in the ground. So clearly there are zones within this area that are suggestive of buried electrically conducted targets. We can kind of discount this one over here on your right, because it appears in the very shallow response as well as the deeper response, so we think that this is some sort of very shallow buried target. But at depth, it would seem that there is this sort of trending feature through there that has the sorts of signature that we might associate with a significant quantity of buried metal, potentially, if you were so inclined, interpretable as a cache of buried Spitfire aircraft. So, these were called Zone B and Zone A, and we decided to do a test excavation around Zone A. So, we had an excavator come along, it dug a hole. Eventually, it hit some wood, and at that point you're like, wow, this might be it. But then, for some reason that I still don't know, the Burmese closed the dig. They said, right, no more. And I think it was because somewhere, somehow, someone had negotiated that we would do some tests, and then if anything actually looked promising, there would be a whole series of other negotiations, because you were potentially talking about quite a lot of money buried in the ground there. Spitfires sell for something like £4 million at auction, so having 12 of them all of a sudden, you're talking some quite serious money. So, at the end of that dig, having found some promising, having heard the crunch of this excavator bucket go through some wood, potentially the crate of our crated up Spitfire, we had to kind of call it a day. So, is that the end? David certainly wasn't going to abandon this project. His big statement was, Spitfires saved our neck in the Battle of Britain. They shouldn't be left to rot. This is exactly what I mean about people's obsession with Spitfires and them not being treated just like machinery and weapons of destruction. As it turns out, if you wanted to say that any plane saved our neck in the Battle of Britain, it was the Hurricane, because there was far more hurricanes involved in the Battle of Britain. But again, people don't think about that, they just like Spitfires. So, David certainly wasn't going to give this up, which takes us to Act 2, the revival of the Spitfire story. Bring back the timeline, and we're talking roughly 10 years ago. In fact, about 10 years ago, 10 years ago and 5 days, possibly, I was at the Imperial War Museum in London, and we were given a press conference about the second round of surveying that we were about to do. In that interim period, Burma had gone through its kind of peaceful revolution. These are some shots that I took in 2013. Aung San Suu Kyi there talking freely with Barack Obama. Unfortunately, in recent years, the revolution has sort of petered out, but at the time, Burma felt like a very opening up place. Here is David Cameron talking, discussing with President Sinn Féin of Myanmar at the time, and they are talking about the Spitfire project, and that's no word of a lie. They are negotiating access and actually who owns these Spitfires if they were to be found. So this went very, very high. Helping David at this time was the company Wargaming, and this gentleman you can see next to David is Tracy Spate. He is the director of special projects at Wargaming. Now, Wargaming, some of the more embryonic members of the room might know, that Wargaming is a video game company, and you can go online and you can play World of Warplanes and World of Tanks, and you can fly a World War II plane and everything like that. They would argue that kind of fidelity to a lot of this military hardware is kind of in the DNA of their company. So they wanted to sponsor this project, but they wanted to sponsor it and make sure it was done right. They wanted a documentary film crew to be there to kind of record it, And they wanted to bring in archaeologists as well, people who actually do this stuff for a living, who do it for a job, who know the documentary evidence well, so that everything could be supported. They didn't want it to be just a snatch and grab of some aircraft out of Myanmar and then forget about it. They wanted a full archaeological assessment of the site, which was really commendable. So there's just a few more people to introduce you to here. This is the team of archaeologists. Rod Scott is, was a member of the British Army, and his specialism is in munitions. When you're excavating on these conflict sites, it's possible that you will come across unexploded bombs, and Rod is there to kind of oversee that and make sure that any bomb disposal is undertaken safely. Martin Brown has a superpower. He can see things in the soil that you and I can't see. He can interpret the textures of the soil, the colours of the soil, and he can tell you about things that have been disturbed there. And Andy Brockman, who's the lead archaeologist. Andy is an expert documentarian. He knows the archives and the process of assessing those archives absolutely like the back of his hand. And it's fairly safe to say that there was some scepticism amongst the archaeologists about this Spitfire story. On one hand, they kind of roll their eyes and say, oh, it's just another Spitfire story, because for them, every time someone mentions British archaeology from the war and also says Spitfires, it's like, oh yeah, here we go. It's the same like how when you hear about German remains, Nazi remains, it's always buried treasure, or always buried gold trains, or stolen art, or something like that. So if it had been anything else, they'd have been a bit less sceptical, but the fact it's Spitfires buried at the end of the runway is, you know, a story that's 10 a penny. So that really kind of, they almost look like they're getting on here, but it does bring David and Andy into a bit of conflict at times. One of the other kind of slightly less tongue-in-cheek sources of scepticism about this story was that David would say that before they were buried, the Spitfires were shipped in via Rangoon docks and taken to Mingalodon, RAF Mingalodon, and then prepared for burial. But in 1945, the docks were effectively inoperable. They were controlled by the Japanese, and the Allies bombed the hell out of them. So this is the docks. And so they would say that that initial part of David's story about how the Spitfires got there in the first place doesn't really stack up. It's problematic because that is the state of the docks. But nonetheless, they do accept that there is a geophysical signature to investigate. So let's go out there and actually see what it's about. And if they were ever going to be proven wrong, this was the project they wanted to be proven wrong on, because if you do find this massive cache of Spitfires, then hey, brilliant. It's, you know, it's wonderful. Meanwhile, the media was having a real field day, so in a lot of the British press, I haven't sullied my slides with the Daily Mail, but the Daily Mail was all over it as well. It went international, which is the Spiegel, which is the kind of one of the big newspapers in Germany. So the media is all over this and kind of building up all the hype on the project. And so, like I say, in November 2012, we were at a press conference in the Imperial War Museum about to embark on another project in Burma. And this is where things started to take a turn for the slightly more weird, because in the lead up to this, David had started to use this expression, plane shapes in boxes. When people said, how can you be sure that you found the Spitfires? I wanted to say, oh, well, of course we can't. We have found evidence of metallic debris that is consistent with the burial of Spitfires. But David doesn't only say we have found plane shapes in boxes, he'll start saying things like, oh, you can see the cockpit there and things like that. Now, that cannot be done from our geophysical data. So at first you think, well, yeah, he's just got it wrong. We'll clarify that in the clean-up and make sure that the newspaper articles are all appropriate. But, like I say, things continue to take a turn for the weird, because when we turned up at the airport, this was the sign that greeted us. You can't see it at the back. It says, Shui Tangpo Group of Companies, who were the local industrial contact in Yangon, Spitfire excavation. Now, as far as I'm concerned, we haven't even found any Spitfires yet. I don't know if they're there. But here we are. We have a Spitfire excavation that is a big sign at the airport for the world to see. Anyway, there was work to do. So we showed up in January 2013 with, you can see that same piece of electromagnetic apparatus. We also brought along some other bits of kit and some other people. This is a former Leeds PhD student, Andy Merritt, my colleague there, Roger Clark, me again with another piece of equipment. Over there, Andy has a GPS, so just simply doing a topographic survey of the area, looking for the lumps and bumps across the site that potential burials can reveal. I've got a magnetic instrument there, and yeah, so we've got a whole collection of stuff that we're doing. So the first thing we did was just to put ourselves back in the picture, to go and repeat part of the 2004 survey, just to check that we were in the kind of right sort of place. So let's take a look at what happened. That is a line, the distance through the grid on the x-axis and the electrical conductivity on the y-axis. And they are the readings that we recorded in 2013. So you can see there's these two discrete places of elevated electrical conductivity in the middle of that field. We went and did the same line in the new survey, and this is what we got. So the dark red line there shows no peak over there, and certainly a very disturbed area over here. So some initial evidence that something has changed, and certainly no sign of strong electrical conductivity in the ground at that point. Here's another set of electrical observations that we make. Here we've got an electrical cross-section through the ground. And what I was hoping to see here is that if you do have a great big box full of metallic stuff, you should see a zone of high electrical conductivity in the ground here. High electrical conductivity in the ground would have these dark blue colours, kind of right in the middle of that if we were in the right place. And we don't see that. And when I get my geophysical eyes in, you could almost imagine in there is a scar. Burial. So something has been excavated, it's been backfilled. I think you can see where I'm going with this one. So, what has happened to that site? Martin Brown and David Cundall had a chat and they thought, well, we've got to investigate this, we've got to see whether anything was there at all, we've got to see what has happened to it. So, let's do an excavation. So we chatted to David and David said, yes, okay, that sounds like a sensible plan, that's a sensible place to dig. So we excavated. And this is the trench that we dug, digging down a fair way to try and identify whether a Spitfire's there. In the bottom of this trench, you get into what we call blue clay, so undisturbed natural stuff. The archaeologist says there's no way things can be buried beneath there because this stuff hasn't been disturbed for thousands of years. So that's kind of the bottom, and we find nothing. What they did find in the backfill, however, was a few plastic bags that definitely don't come from 1945, the time of the alleged burial. Martin Brown can also see evidence of other kind of scars and backfill in here. So something very mysterious has gone on. We did find little bits of metal. Here's Rod Scott with a section of what we call PSP, pierced steel planking. Pierced steel planking is the kind of stuff that you lay out to make an emergency road over unaccessible terrain. So if you have to taxi planes or drive tanks across a very, very muddy terrain, you lay down a bunch of this stuff and you make a temporary road. So, you know, there is some evidence of metal being around here, but certainly most of this seems to have disappeared. We did do a few bits of other geophysical surveys. There's the original data set. We went off down here, and there are other things that we could interpret here. We think that this area of high electrical conductivity here is related to modern electrical cables, because you might not be able to see it at the back, but this PAPI is PAPI, Precision Approach, Precision Illumination, I think, something like that. Precision Approach Pathway Illumination, I think, runway lights. So, electrical cables potentially in there, not somewhere you want to dig up. This area here was interpreted as being steel reinforced concrete. You could see patches of it exposed here and there. So, nothing in here, again, was suggestive of there being buried Spitfires at any wider point of the site. So, where does that leave us? This comes into Act 3. That's the end of Act 2. This is what David had to say at the end of that. He was frustrated that the archaeologists were taking this meticulous archaeological approach to the excavation, when actually David was up for digging elsewhere. Not necessarily without any evidence, not necessarily with any evidence for, you know, places where you'd want to dig, but nonetheless keen to dig elsewhere. And what David said is, I think more of the Spitfires than the archaeology. The archaeologists think more of the archaeology than the Spitfires. But the Spitfires are the archaeology. You can't have Spitfires without the archaeology and the history of that site. Indeed, the excavations that we have done now become part of the history of that site. So for David to say this is something of a misunderstanding about what archaeologists were there for and what the process, what the actual scientific process of archaeology is. So, brings us to Act 3. Is it all a load of bullshit? Fast forward in the timeline. We are now at 2013, in the aftermath of the abortive Spitfire excavation. What I want to show you here is an air photo from 2013. This is a Google Earth image, and it just so happened that the air photo here shows the extent of our excavations in our project. So you might just be able to see here the scar of something there, that's that big trench that we dug, and there was also some small exploration trenches we dug down here that I'll come on to later in the talk. But that is kind of extent of the excavations that we did. There was another air photo that came to light from 2005, showing that. That is a whole series of excavations of spoil heaps at the site. Now, what I'm very proud of as a geophysicist is that before we'd seen this, I identified that this had happened. You could see it clearly in the data. We could kind of rumble whoever had been there and dug up whatever happened to be there before. I think it probably wasn't Spitfires, because you've probably heard about it. But whatever they did find is kind of a mystery. I suspect it's a whole bunch of that buried PSP. But I don't know that, because it's gone. That's it. Nothing more you can say about it. So, some strange things going on. Andy Brockman started doing more documentary research, and he started to investigate the origins of these pictures that David had been using to say proved that there were Spitfires being boxed up. What you can see in this image just here, very, very oblique, but in here, I can just about read, it says ER241, 242 or something like that. That looks like the registration of the plane. So Andy was able to track down where this plane was sent to and its fate and what happened to it. And he says that that image fairly categorically comes from Gibraltar. That is not planes being boxed up in Burma. But even though we kind of mentioned that, papers, one who I've already mentioned and I won't mention again, still talk about this image and say this shows planes being buried in Myanmar. So there's other problems. What did Stan see? Stan, who says that some serviceman said to him, oh yeah, the Spitfires in them boxes. Now it's important to note that the archaeologists consider Stan to be a perfectly reliable witness. What they don't consider to be perfectly reliable is David Cundall's interpretation of his evidence. When questioned away from David, Stan will say, well, there was so much kind of going on at the end of the war. We never really knew who was telling the truth or anything. And to be honest, they could have been pulling my leg. You know, it's kind of banter between servicemen to say, oh, Spitfire's in that box. He obviously did see boxes. What Andy unearthed was that eventually, when Rangoon docks became operable, there were planes that were delivered there. You're not going to be able to see this at the back. This is a delivery of 19 Oster aircraft. These are small reconnaissance aircraft that would have been delivered in crates like what Stan might have seen. So it's possible Stan did indeed see crates. But they didn't contain Spitfires. That was a serviceman pulling his leg. We wanted, though, to sort of see what Stan really did see. And what I said was that this coming through here is the old prone road through the airfield. Some of our geophysical data extends just over this area here. And this is some of our magnetic data. And you see there's this very, very bright response. And I suggested that around this area you could see exposures of steel reinforced concrete. So the fact it's got steel in it means it's very, very detectable for our magnetic surveying equipment. So we mapped out this particular, what looks like an old kind of taxiway or some kind of dispersal area from the runway. Place it over this air photo and you can find out where the prone road is. You can find where Stanley was actually standing. So that little bar there is the excavation trench that we put in, guided by the geophysical data. Martin Brown comes in and this is what we find. And even, you don't need Martin's kind of super eyes to see this one, I don't think. You can see the slightly redder patch coming through in the side of that trench. And that is the prone road. Not only that, that rather sad-looking artefact in there is a sandbag. That is a sandbag trench on either side of the prone road. And for me, I still just got it. That puts a right tingle down my spine. The fact that we were stood where servicemen from both sides were stood and were fighting and potentially were dying. So for David to say that the archaeology is not associated with the Spitfires and the Spitfires are not associated with the archaeology is a complete misrepresentation of what we're trying to do there. So there is the big question, and I'm going to put it to you. Who dug the site in 2005? Any guesses? There you go. Potentially the Burmese government, potentially David. Any other suggestions? Some kind of rogue treasure hunters or something like that? You're correct. David dug the site in 2005. Obviously, we went and asked him this. We said, yeah, the documentary crew went to his house and they were filming him and said, so why didn't you tell the group that you'd already excavated there, and why did you let them excavate there again? His answer, they didn't ask me. Now, as a geophysicist, when I'm working with a client, I will say the more you can tell me about a site, the better a job of a survey I can do for you. So to kind of hear that is really it's quite offensive and upsetting. People say, well, let David do what he wants, because at the end of the day, it's his own money. But that's not the case, is it? It might be his own money. In fact, he gets sponsored by companies to go off and do this. So it's not really his own money. But even then, he's damaging the reputation of geophysics, geophysicists, and archaeology. When those excavations were going on, it wasn't David who was driving the digger. David was sat at some pavilion somewhere. So if there is unexploded bombs and things like that in the site, quite possible as a battlefield, David isn't the one at risk. The Burmese excavator operator is the one at risk. So actually, I don't believe that David isn't just doing I don't believe he's doing no harm by just kind of pursuing his passion. So there you go. There are a lot more questions to answer, I'm sure, and I know we're going to do a bit of a Q&A. But Christmas is coming. Do support your local archaeologist with considering purchasing the buried Spitfires of Burma. You get the full account there. But with that, I'll thank you very much for your attention, and just like to thank the people on the slide there. Cheers now.